How important is it going to be able to speak Spanish in the United States or have Latino leaders within our private organizations based on everything that you're talking about today?
Yeah, so the Hispanic population in the United States, well, I mean, let's be honest, it's 80% Mexicans. The Mexican population in the United States is the fastest growing demographic. It is the youngest demographic. It is the demographic that has seen an increase in its value add and its educational system most quickly. And then, of course, it's obviously an interface with Mexico proper. So it really matters where you are. The closer to the southwest border you happen to be, the bigger this issue is, but it is going to be an issue for everyone. They're also the consumers of the future. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, they are the demographic that we have absorbed in this country most quickly. Spanish disappears from Mexican migrants typically within 1 to 2 generations. That's the fastest ever. One of the really weird cultural things with Hispanics and especially with Mexicans is a lot of them think of the term gringo as an aspiration, not as a pejorative. And if you ask a second generation Hispanic, they will probably on census forms say they're white. They see it as a cultural term, not a racial term. Now, does that mean I don't think you should work on Spanish skills? Not what I'm saying. I'm saying it might not be as critical on this side of the border as you think it is. The other side of the border, Spanish, 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 Spanish. And let's be honest, the interface with the Hispanics of Mexico is going to be far more productive, far more cost effective, and far more important than anything we have ever done with East Asia. And based on demographics, it will be for at least the next half century. So that is the future of not just your market and a large part of your workforce, but what allows you to do everything else. So yes, I would invest in it. I'm just saying you might not need it for what you think you need it for.
Jim Mooney from New York Transco, just so you know who's asking you the question. What role do you think AI plays in some of these equations going forward?
Oh, I forgot that.
It's a big,
it's probably
a lot of
not
concern
going to.
Everywhere for everything.
Okay, so it probably isn't going to, because those AI chips, the 10 nanometers and smaller, those are the ones we're most likely to lose and not have for about a decade while we rebuild the structured environment that allows us to build them at scale. Now, they're not going to go to zero, but we're going to have to choose what we're going to put them into. Do we put them to EVs? Do we put into power management systems where, you know, there's one of those chips is in every smart meter for a house that also has solar panels. So that, in theory, is a bigger market than what we do for iPhones. Or do we put them in electric vehicles? Or do we put them in server farms? Because we're not going to have enough for all of that. We're going to have enough probably for one of those applications. And until we have that shortage, we haven't made up that decision. But the idea that we're going to be doing this at scale and have massive server farms with millions of these chips, that can't happen. With ChatGPT, we're seeing that this technology has probably now passed the operational stage. So all we need are the chips. The question is, how long is it going to take us to rebuild that pipeline? And I would say 8 to 12 years.
Daniel Sierra, Burns & McDonnell. Sorry, over here. My apologies.
Thanks.
So I guess you're talking about the Mexican market and the labor there. What happens after we use all that up, I guess, per se? What's the next country that you see coming down the road?
All of this is very inflationary because we're trying to do a lot with limited supply of capital and labor. If we do succeed in building the infrastructure down into central Mexico and the industrial plant does take form the way that the market seems like it's going to push for, it's going to be the same thing we did here. When we gobbled up all available labor in roughly 1990, just kind of put a stake in the ground, we found out we had to go up market. And we had to get better at using capital and labor more effectively, and that's when we saw our productivity skyrocket. I would expect that we would have a secondary issue like that in the United States, and then Mexico will go through a 1990s style boom as they are forced to move up the value-added scale. Now, Mexico over the last 30 years has moved up the value-added scale at a faster rate than any country ever before. They're on average, I'd say, twice as productive as the average Chinese, and their compensation is less than half as much. So they're already skewing towards being amazing. This will just speed it up, but it will be inflationary.
Brandon Young Management. Question for you is around technical education.
Okay.
Where are you seeing the trends going, or will we run out of the younger generation wanting to go into more technical related roles like engineering, power, utility?
Yeah.
Talk about that and when that's going to end.
It's not going to end in the next 15 years. Two things. Number one, the type of work we're probably going to see have the most price pressure is machine shops. It's a skill set that expands pretty quickly, but on small scale. And we're going to have to do a lot of the manufacturing and the maintenance for things that you would normally just buy an entirely new component relatively close to your headquarters, because it's going to have to be a patch job. We're not going to have the production that's necessary. Second, you're probably all going to have to establish training programs, not in high schools, but in elementary schools, to build your own inflow for these jobs, because in an environment of very strict and increasing labor shortages, whoever gets their hooks into the kids first is likely to be the ones who then get the labor when it's time. And the time to start on that was yesterday. Because we have to wait for the millennials' kids to enter the market. That's 2045. And so you're all fighting for a small pool of antisocial children.
Hi, Nelson Goes, IEC Engineering Construction. So you seem like you're bearish on China, right?
That's a word you could use, yeah.
So, and to borrow your phrase, you said, Russia is buying time by their current,
War.
Yeah, war. Yeah. How do you view that kind of thought process applying to China as, if Taiwan is a $14 trillion semiconductor market, and you're saying they don't have enough adults in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So how do you see that playing out and them making a move towards Taiwan in the next, 5, 10 years?
So because of the information vacuum in China now, it's impossible to know whether or not there's going to be an attack, because Xi doesn't talk with anyone. There's no one's phone you can bug to find out what he's thinking. Also, if the Chinese were to make a move on Taiwan, even if they capture it in a matter of 6 weeks without a shot fired, they don't know how to operate those semiconductor facilities because they can't operate their own. They use imported labor to do all of the quality checks on all of the wafers. And the ones in Taiwan are the world's most advanced. The ones in China are very much the other side. So if they got them, they would just be big paperweights, and obviously that would remove semiconductors for the rest of us, but it wouldn't really help them technologically. And it would trigger, among other things, the United States to act militarily. And it's not like we would confront the Chinese in the South China Sea or anything. We'd probably just put a couple destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy flow and cut the ability of them to import the things they need to grow their own food. So China would be facing a national collapse within a couple of years if they do pull the trigger on Taiwan. Normally, I would say that this would mean that they wouldn't even consider it. But again, Xi is now in an information black box, and we can't rule it out. All I can tell you for sure is that one way or another, some country involved in the supply chain somewhere is going to crack. I'm actually more concerned about Germany than I am about Taiwan, but it would have the same impact. The Germans specifically make the lenses that allow all of the lithography to happen. No lenses, no lithography, no chips. The hope, because people seem to like me to say things that are hopeful, is that there is a new lithography technology that is coming out that has fewer parts and doesn't require neon, which we're dependent on the Russians and the Chinese for, that might have a simpler supply chain. But if we ironed out all the kinks of that today, it's not going to be applied at scale in Taiwan within 3 years. So there are potentially ways forward here, but I find it unlikely that we're going to be able to avoid a disruption in that specific market. It's too vulnerable to too many things. But probably not that one. Probably. If it does happen, well, then it's all gone. Yeah.
Over here. Hey, Peter, you talked a lot about Xi Jinping in China. I just wonder what your thoughts are on Vladimir Putin in Russia and what's going on.
Okay, well, I mean, all world leaders, democratic or otherwise, have problems with narcissism and ego. We're not immune to that. The question is how honest you are about your own capacity. So Putin has also established a bit of a cult of personality and has also purged the system of people who might rise up to replace him. But he started from a much lower base, which has shaped how much he's willing to carve out. So at the end of the Cold War, well, sorry, let me go back, 1983, there was a coup in the Soviet Union. And the intelligence services took over, purged all the other factions from the Communist Party. This is the Andropov coup. And Andropov, Chernomyrdin, and Gorbachev, they were the first three, ran the country until the end. Putin is part of that clique, and the intelligence professionals took over after the fall and have run it until now. And Putin has bit by bit removed people who he thought was threatening, and he hasn't done a lot to bring up a new generation from below. So Putin's inner circle today is less than 10 people, half of whom are utterly incompetent. If you ever see anything by Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, he's the most incompetent of them. You can ignore whatever he says. But there are a few of them that actually do provide him with advice and context. So I think the best example I can give you is if you go back to the January before the war, I'm sorry, the March, and the words. March, just after the war began, when Putin was making all the nuclear threats, the U.S. ambassador was dispatched, and the message was something like this, like, Mr. President, just think of things from a little different angle here. You remember back in January when you decided and you gave the order for the day the war was going to start, and you were in the bunker under the Kremlin that was completely sealed. It was walk-in safe, no electronics, no notes. And an hour after you left that meeting, we published the notes of the meeting in the media. That was our way of telling you that we know where your person is at any given moment. So if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen we send back are going to go anywhere except straight up, you're out of your mind. So stop it. The point is that Putin has meetings. He has people, he's discussed things, which means you can hack into the fax system in the email, you can tap the phones, there's ways to learn. And as bad as the demographic situation is in Russia, there's still a massive producer and exporter of food and energy, whereas China now has no inner circle, no communication, no way to find out anything, and are the world's largest importer of pretty much everything that keeps people alive. So in the worst case scenario for the Russians, they will still persist longer than in the best case scenario for the Chinese. China's almost over. The Russians have at least another decade and a half to 2 decades. But this is still probably the last generation of Russian leadership.
So Peter, with the labor shortages you articulated and sort of this focus on ESG across the world, how do you reconcile the idea of, one, undocumented workers or forced labor really being something that folks want to purge out of their supply chain? I'm not going to ask, is it possible, but is it happy talk to say that, or can you really?
No, I think it's reasonable. 2 things to keep in mind. Number 1, forced labor, different hemisphere. A lot of the stuff from that other hemisphere is going to stop anyway. And forced labor is going to be some of our least of our concerns when it comes to human rights issues. So I would expect those supply chains to wither for independent reasons. Second, business community, swing voters. One of the things that people missed about Governor DeSantis of Florida is that he hasn't gone to war with Disney. He's gone to war with the Florida business community. ESG, is it doing a good job? Questionable. Is it taking us to where we need to go? I don't know. But since the business community is no longer part of the conversation, they are trying to figure out where they fit into American society. ESG is a component of that. It's an internal conversation. And so every business is approaching this from their own way, based on their own circumstances, their own geography, their own politics, their own workforce. And of course, they're all coming up with different conclusions, some of which are, But when people on the left or the right yell at business about ESG, business just gets pissed off because they're doing the best they can when they're not allowed in the room. So when I hear people like Ramaswamy or DeSantis screaming about ESG, it's like all you are doing is making it easier for the business community to never support the Republican Party again. So there are consequences, and we're going to see them in the presidential and the general election next year. But they're going to be unpredictable in a way that we're not used to seeing out of that community. We're used to the business community being the adults in the room. Now, more specifically to your question about child labor, since there are no standards in ESG, since every company comes at it from their own angle for their own reasons, there is no pattern, in my opinion. So we're going to be waiting to see what happens in terms of international capacity to build this stuff. And those countries are not going to snap in neat order or all at once. So I hate to say this, this is a tier 3 supplier issue. And there is not going to be a database that allows us to map this on its way down.
Hi, Andrea Hubianco from RWE. I just have a question. Do you think IQ demographics plays a role into this global dynamic, and also some population attributes like the flexibility, adaptability is
That's all cultural stuff, and yes, it does. It's a lot harder to map out than just the sheer numbers, but there's certainly indications that different cultures are better or worse at doing different things at different stages of the production cycle. So for example, Americans are very good at brain work. We have the highest value-added designers in the world. The Mexicans are great at production. They're the highest value-added manufacturers in the world. But if you were to increase the cost of labor in Mexico by a factor of 5, they'd probably give us a run for our money. It's not an issue of us or them being smarter or dumber than the other one. They're at a different stage of their economic cycles and their growth, and we have different infrastructures to work with. So I've never seen a study that looks at race from an IQ point of view that has ever held up. Every time I've ever seen it, they've kind of thrown it out. It's at best noise, but that doesn't mean we're all in the same place.
Hi, Peter. Kyle Pinn from Burns McDonnell. What would you say is the biggest impact to your models, your hypotheses, based on who wins the next presidential election?
Oh, I mean, I can tell you exactly who's going to win. It's going to be Biden. It's going to be a landslide. And we've known this for over a year. So one of the things about January 6th is it happened just after an election, so its effects haven't been fully felt in terms of who votes for who. But when we got to the midterms, despite expecting a red wave, we had a red burp in the House and a red loss in the Senate. And what we found out is that the independents in the United States had changed considerably. Couple things. Number one, Trump has basically told independents that the general election doesn't matter, which means that the independents don't matter, and because the general election is the only place that the independents have a voice. And so they reacted to that. In exit polling, something crazy, like 85% of independents said that they despised the White House's economic policies and felt that they hurt independents more than anyone else. And independents are fickle. They almost always switch sides every election. They get buyer's remorse. And in the time before, they had voted for Biden. And now they were clearly fed up with him, but almost all of them voted for Democrats anyway. There's a saying in the State Department in the Middle East that we support one person, one vote, but not just one time. And if the independents were going to show up in numbers to vote against their own personal economic best interests in order to make sure they could vote again in an off year, you can bet they're going to do so in the general. Trump will probably carry no more than 12 states. And then the Republican Party is going to have to decide what to do with that. And the people who are, oh no, I broke it. The people who are here, the rhinos, are going to have to decide if they want to try to wait it out, which hasn't worked yet, or move on. And we'll know within 2 years.
All right, I think we're going to do one more question.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Steve Thornhill with Burns McDonnell. I guess you keep talking about China's going to collapse, Germany's going to collapse. What does that look like? Is that anarchy? Is that revolution?
Well, let's start with the Germans because that's probably simpler. Assuming for the moment that there's not a general European war, it will be a very organized decline because they're German. And we will see individual sectors that the Germans are no longer competitive fall off one after another. That's already happened in chemicals. It's already happened in processing. I'd say the next really big one will probably be automotive. Automotive requires customers. And in Europe, that was tapped out a long time ago. And in China, it's been tapped out now for 5 years. And if they relocate their supply chains to North America like the Japanese have, that means German workers aren't doing it anymore. So they're going to probably, things like transformers will probably be some of the last things that they do at scale. And they just fade away, unless there's a security crisis, in which case, God knows. China's collapsed over 20 times in its history. And every time it's gone down, they've lost at least a quarter of their population. Just playing the odds because there's enough of a data set that you can do that with Chinese collapses, you get a civilizational break that kills over half the population because they're so dependent on energy and foodstuffs and food production inputs now. The North probably gets the worst of that. That's where about 2/3 of the population lives. And it'll probably fall into kind of a neo-Maoist tyranny. And remember that Xi has purged everyone who's capable. So there's no backup governments, even at the local level, waiting in the wings, which probably means warlords. Again, Chinese history suggests that. And then the southern cities, from Shanghai to Hong Kong, they don't back up to a hinterland. They're kind of divorced from the rest of the Chinese system, always have been. And I would expect them to integrate with foreign powers in order to get food and energy. They'll trade their labor and their infrastructure to participate in someone else's supply chain. Historically speaking, that's usually how it's gone. These cities have gotten the majority of their calories from foreign partners for most of the last 1,600 years. The communist period is a real aberration in terms of actually being united with the Chinese whole. That's probably how it goes down. But again, this has happened over 20 times. There's a lot of potential paths. That's not the worst one.
Awesome. Let's give Peter a round of applause. Thank you so much.